Hey everybody. I am super excited to be here. For the past 2 years, I think, everybody's been telling me how great React Rally is and that I have to attend it. And yet last year, I didn't make it. And this year, I'm finally here. And the past 2 days have been just amazing. So big shout out to Jameson and Matt for making it happen. Couldn't have done it without them. I'm here today because I want you to contribute to open source. As somebody who does a fair amount of open source work, I get asked every now and then, but Max, how can I get started contributing to open source? How do I get green GitHub squares? How does that all work? The answer I give in person is usually pretty short because I don't have half an hour and can bore you all. But the answer I usually give is just solve your own goddamn problems. You know, that's literally all there is to it, right? As developers, we have lots of problems. What we do as developers is solving problems. And so all you do is you have a problem, you solve the problem, and you share your solution. That's it. That's all there is to it. Open sourcing helps you. This is something that I didn't understand for a very long time, but when I finally got it, I got it because I helped myself, in the sense that I had a problem, I solved the problem, I shared the solution on GitHub, and nobody used it. But then half a year later, I was like, I have to implement the same thing again. Oh, wait, I did that half a year ago, and I pushed it up to GitHub, right? Wait, I just used my own solution. I've already done this before. And that was it. You know, I'd solved the problem before, so I solved it again. So open sourcing, when I open source things, most of the time, I open source things for myself. Because I already know that future Max might have this problem again. And future Max also doesn't want to solve that same fucking problem all over again. So what I do is I just copy and paste my solution so I have it for next time, right? And so that you can have it too. The worst case scenario, quite literally, is that you have a solution for the next time you have that problem. That's the worst case scenario. That's a pretty good worst case scenario. Like, who's going to complain about that? So I wrote a quick 4-step guide to open source. The first step is you solve your problem. We've covered that. The second step is you generalize the solution. And then comes the third step. The third step is a bunch of question marks. And then the fourth step is profit. In our case, that's open source, right? Because that's how it works. The reason that step 3 is a bunch of question mark is because step 3 is actually like 100 steps, right? But those steps are covered already, right? If you don't know how to use Git, you can Google that. There's tutorials for it. If you've never been on GitHub, there's docs for it, right? You can Google that. There's a bunch of documentation around step 3 and all of the other steps that involves. But most people struggle already with the first 2 steps, right? Where do you even, like, what is a good solution and what do I do with it? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. A short note here. If your employer doesn't allow you to open source things, please don't open source things. You're probably going to get into legal trouble, and that's not very fun. Probably find another employer instead. It's a pretty good way of doing it. And I'm just kidding, but obviously, if your employer forbids you from doing open source, I'm sorry, I can't help you there. So let me give you some examples of these first 2 steps from my own experience, right? A while ago, I had to implement support for logging in with GitHub into my app. It's a pretty common thing, right? People want to be able to log in with social media into applications. You've probably seen login with Google, you've probably seen login with Twitter. In my case, it just was login with GitHub because I don't know why. GitHub has a bunch of documentation around how to build this feature, how to implement that in your app. And just like logging in with Google or logging in with Twitter, it's based on a standard called OAuth. OAuth is a standard that defines how to authenticate people, right? That's what the standard defines. So I'd never really heard or used, well, I'd heard of OAuth, but I'd never really used it. And then I Googled it, and I found diagrams like this one. The OAuth authentication flow. My reaction when I saw that was, wait, what? How does this work? It's not very easy. Like, OAuth isn't super easy to implement, and even though GitHub has great documentation, it still was a bit of a pain to implement, you know? I spent a couple of hours or days on it, and eventually I got it to work. You know, people could authenticate with GitHub. So it worked. Yay, done. I submit a PR, and that's it, right? But then what I do is I ask myself, can I make it open source? And it turns out I can, because OAuth is very complex. What you do is, there's a bunch of parts to it, right? There's a front end, obviously, where you have a button that says logging in with GitHub. If that doesn't exist, it doesn't work. Captain Obvious. And then there's a back-end part of it, where you have to redirect to GitHub, and then GitHub comes back to you, and you have to redirect to GitHub again, and then GitHub redirects your user again, and then you have to redirect. There's a bunch of redirects going on, and you go to GitHub and back and forth. And it's super annoying, and you have to take care of states, and yada, yada, yada. It's just super annoying. So that part, I thought, I don't want to do that again. If I ever have to build if I ever have to build logging in with GitHub again, I don't really want to take care of that part anymore. So I built a tiny microservice that does that, right? It's on GitHub. I put it on GitHub and made it open source, right? But really, it's just a server. It's an Express server. It has a single JavaScript file. That JavaScript file has 57 lines of code, right? It's not, you could have written this in like 15 minutes. It's not anything special, right? It's just a Node.js server. But the next time I have to build logging in with GitHub again, I can just use this microservice. I don't have to build it again in my app. I just extracted that part from my routes, and that's it. So my first pro tip for doing open source is ask yourself the magic question. Can I make it open source? This works a lot like a muscle, I think, where at the beginning, I asked myself that only when I built something very special that I'd never heard of, and that's it. By now, every single time I solve any problem, no matter how small it is, I think to myself, can I make it open source, right? It's sort of like a muscle that you have to train. It's the open source muscle. By now, actually, most of the time when I have a problem, I think, how can I build this so it can be open source? But that's a different thing, right? So this is a very good question to ask yourself. If you want to do open source, if you want to share your solutions with others, and if you don't want to solve the same problem 100 times, this is a great question to ask yourself. Just whenever you submit a PR, think to yourself, wait a second, could I make that open source somehow? And not everything can be open sourced. That's another caveat, right? A lot of the things will be specific to your application. A lot of the things are specific to your domain. A lot of the things just don't make sense to be open sourced. But the more you ask yourself this question, the more you will realize that actually quite a few things can be open sourced and make sense to be open sourced. There's another caveat here, which is before you make something open source that already exists, look if it already exists. And don't solve the same problem, because that's not very smart. Other people might have solved the same problem before, right? In my case, with logging in with GitHub, other people had solved that problem, but not in the way that I needed it, right? I couldn't fit it into my app, so I had to create another thing. Let me give you another example. I had to add social media sharing buttons to a website. This was like 2 years ago, right? I don't do this anymore, but 2 years ago, I wanted to add social media sharing buttons to my website. If you've never done this before, the way you do it is you go to Facebook and you copy a code snippet and you put it on the page. The issue is that that code snippet is a JavaScript file. So I tried all of the different social networks, and they're massive. So if you try and render a Facebook sharing button, an official Facebook share button, you're loading 73.3 kilobytes of JavaScript, and you're doing 3 network requests. The same thing applies to Twitter, right? For Twitter, you're loading 52.7 kilobytes of JavaScript and doing 4 network requests. For LinkedIn, 47.7 kilobytes and 2 network requests. And I could go on and on and on. It's ridiculous. I want to render 5 fucking buttons and I have to load 200 kilobytes of JavaScript. It's ridiculous. It's buttons. How hard can it be to render a button? Come on. My reaction when I saw this was literally, what? It's pretty stupid, honestly. There's a great quote by Joey Armstrong that you might have heard of, which is, you wanted a banana, but what you got was a gorilla holding the banana and an entire jungle. Now, he was talking about object-oriented programming. Rephrased slightly, it fits very well to social media sharing buttons. You wanted a button, but what you got was a gorilla holding the button and an entire JavaScript framework. That is what social media sharing buttons feel like. It's super annoying. I just want a button. How hard can that be? So I went ahead and I reverse engineered social media sharing buttons. Now, reverse engineered is a very fancy word of saying I looked at what they do. Because as it turns out, the way these sharing buttons work is you click them and they go to a link. For example, facebook.com/share. And then you have two query params for a URL and some text. And you put that URL and the text in there, and it renders a form with that URL and that text. And that's it. So I need 73.3 kilobytes to render a link? I don't think so. So I reverse engineered all of the social media sharing buttons, and eventually I got a bunch of sharing buttons on my page without having to embed 200 kilobytes of JavaScript. So that was great. I loved it. At that point, I asked myself, can I make it open source? But in this case, it wasn't as obvious, because I could have just taken my sharing buttons and made them open source, but why would you use a sharing button that shares my page? That doesn't make any sense. So I thought to myself, I could write a blog post about how these links work, but that's also not very useful because then people have to copy and paste them, and they still have to render them themselves and style them again. Because when you only have a link, you need to style that thing, right? So that's a bit annoying. So what I did was I built a generator. At sharingbuttons.io, you can enter, it's pretty simple. You enter a URL, you enter some text, you choose which social networks you want. There's a bunch of different styles. You get a live preview of your sharing buttons, and then you get some HTML and some CSS. And you copy that HTML and CSS into your app, and you have sharing buttons. Yay, it's great. And this I open sourced, right? This generator is open source. This was actually one of the first React apps I ever built, like 2 years ago. So please don't look at the code. It's horrible. But, I mean, this is open source now. What I want to show you with this is that sometimes knowledge can be made into an open source project, right? You might learn something, and in many cases, you can help other people, right? The most common thing to do with your knowledge is to write a blog post, right? And that's great. I love, like, if you learn something, please write a blog post about it. You help so many other people. And I wrote like a blog post about the HTML5 details element like 2 years ago. And then a month ago, I had to use it, and I was like, how does that work? And I Googled HTML5 details, and my blog came up. I was like, oh crap, I've already known this. So blog posts are great. But sometimes knowledge can also be made into an open source project rather than just a blog post. And now let me tell you a third story, a very recent one. In my current app, we're building a fully GraphQL-powered app. And when you have GraphQL, you need to use a GraphQL client, like in our case, Apollo client. And the Apollo client does a bunch of caching. And I wanted to implement some custom caching behavior in Apollo client. But when I tried it, it turns out that the documentation for custom resolvers was pretty confusing. Custom resolvers is the feature that I had to use to implement the custom caching behavior. It was pretty confusing. I spent like half a day trying to figure out where the issue is, and then after half a day, I figured it out, and it's only like 10 lines of code, and the issue was somewhere else. But I figured this out. Eventually, I got it to work, right? I got the custom caching behavior to work. So I thought to myself again, as always, can I help open source? And I could. I submitted a pull request to improve the documentation so that you don't have to deal with the same problem. So not only can you create your own projects, and not only can you package your own solutions, sometimes when you have problems with other things, it can be incredibly, incredibly helpful to improve the documentation or improve those libraries. Writing good documentation is extremely hard. When you write a library, you basically have to think to yourself, I could be one of a million different users that could want one of a million different things to do with my library, and you have to take care of every single one of those users. So obviously, you're going to miss some things. Obviously, the documentation, if only you write it, will never be perfect. Writing good documentation is extremely hard and extremely time-consuming. So a very good pro tip is improving documentation is an amazing first contribution. As somebody who has JavaScript libraries that are used by other people, I also have JavaScript libraries that aren't used by other people, documentation PRs are something that I absolutely value the most, right? The code, I can probably write myself, right? Like I can figure out the code. But documentation, I likely have huge blind spots where I'm missing usage patterns that people do. So if you have a problem with the library, go ahead and submit a PR to improve the documentation, right? If you run into troubles where you're like, for a day, banging your head against stuff, just the most annoying stuff that you could think of, after you fix it, please submit a PR to improve the documentation. It's one of the most valuable things you could be doing to help the open source ecosystem as a whole. There's a very important point within this talk, which is that open source projects aren't different from your work projects, right? Open source projects are just packaged solutions. You're already doing 95% of the things anyway. The only difference between your work project and an open source project is the privacy setting on GitHub. That's all there is to it, right? Or maybe if you're using Bitbucket on Bitbucket or on wherever you are. But you're already likely using many of the tools that open source projects use. Making an open source project doesn't mean you have to be Node.js and you have to have a nonprofit and you have to have a charter and you have to have a technical committee and a charter committee and another committee and the TC39 and tons of committees. No, it's just code. It's the same thing as the code you're writing during work anyway, right? There's no difference between your work project and your open source project. I think many people are, I was super scared of doing open source work until I pushed my first repo to GitHub and realized nobody cared anyway. Right? And that's a totally different story, is getting people to care about your stuff. But I didn't care about people caring about my stuff because I wanted to have that solution for the next time I did something. My React boilerplate, which now has like a crazy amount of stars, like 15,000 stars, I think. The reason it exists is because I built sharingbuttons.io, and then I built postcss.parts, and I was like, why am I doing the same folder setup again? That's stupid. So I stopped halfway through postcss.parts, copy and pasted it into a repo, and pushed it to GitHub. Because the next time I wanted to do that, I just had to git clone it, right? That's how it all started. That's why it exists, because I didn't want to do the same crap again. You also won't go from 0 to Dan Abramov overnight. Sorry, Dan. I didn't mean to pick on you. You don't have to be Dan Abramov to be an open source developer. You don't have to maintain React, or you don't have to work on Node.js core. You don't have to work on huge projects with tons of people to work on open source. I have 100,000 repos on GitHub that nobody ever uses, right? Do I care? No, I do it for myself, right? And eventually, one of the solutions that you have might get noticed by other people, and it might get used by other people. But that's not why I do open source. I do open source so I can skip doing the same work again. If you look at my GitHub graph, I registered to GitHub sometime in 2014, and you can see in 2014 I had 3 very intensive days. 3 very, very intensive days of open source work. Then in 2015 I did a bit more, and then in February I was pretty bored. In February I didn't have anything to do, so I did a bunch more open source, and then it stopped again. And then in 2016 it all went crazy, right? And now I've slowed down a bit because you can't go very speedy forever. So I didn't go from 0 to where I am in overnight, right? That just doesn't happen. It's something that happens organically over time. There's another note in this graph that I want to make, which is don't compare yourself unfairly, right? If you look at my contribution graph, 2016 looks fucking awesome. It's all green. It's great. Except I was employed to work on open source. So I cheated. Imagine if all of your work commits showed up on the GitHub graph, which they might, but imagine if all of your work commits showed up on the GitHub graph. Your GitHub graph would look exactly like this, right? It would be all green because you work every day, just like I do. So don't compare yourself with me and think, oh shit, this dude every evening, he codes for hours and hours. How does he do that? I don't. I'm a horrible procrastinator. I watch YouTube half the time, It just wasn't literally my job, So don't compare yourself unfairly, Start small, start with small things, and as you get along, you'll get maybe some big projects. So, to summarize, there's 3 pro tips I want you to remember. The first one is ask the magic question. Whenever you submit a PR, just think to yourself, could I possibly make this open source? What would I have to do to make this open source? Second pro tip is sometimes knowledge can be made into an open source project, right? Think about the next time, write a blog post and then think to yourself, how could I make that into code? What could I do around this blog post to make it into an open source project? And then the third pro tip is, please improve the documentation. I suck at writing. Help me. Thank you very much, React Valley. It's been awesome.